Over 200 years before the Panama Canal was built, the Scottish made an attempt to set up a trade colony there. For many in Scotland, the late 1600s and early 1700s were especially rough. It was the period of the killing times where many were persecuted and even killed for their religious beliefs. It was also the period of the massacre of Glencoe and other oppressions in the Highlands. And it seems it was a time of poor harvest with unusually colder weather. A further financial difficulty was the powerful East Indian Trading Company in England, who, in order to keep their monopoly on trade outside of Britain, made sure laws were passed by the Parliament, limiting Scotland's shipping and exporting. In short, much of Scotland was struggling at this point. In order to try to improve things, the Scottish Parliament passed an act creating the Company of Scotland, trading to Africa and the Indies, the goal of which was to increase trade between Scotland and other countries, especially the Far East. One of the key members of the company was a man named William Paterson, born in Tingwall, Dumfriesshire, who had made his fortune as a trader in London and was instrumental in the foundation of the Bank of England. Paterson had moved back to Scotland, where he helped to establish the Bank of Scotland and joined the Company of Scotland. It was Paterson who suggested establishing a trading colony on the Isthmus of Panama, allowing trade easily between the Pacific and Atlantic Oceans. The idea was approved, and many in England, Scotland, and even other parts of Europe invested. However, opposition quickly arose from the East India Company, who put pressure on the English Parliament to declare that no one from England or the rest of the world could invest in the Scottish Company. This meant that if the plan was to go forward, all the investment must come from Scotland. Scottish citizens responded in huge numbers. Estimates vary from anywhere from one half to one fifth of all the wealth available in Scotland was invested in the scheme. Whatever the amount, it was a sizable amount of money in Scotland, said to be the equivalent of £50 million in today's currency. On July 12th, 1698, the first group of 1,200 colonists set sail for Panama. After an extremely rough sea crossing, where many became ill and a number perished, they made land in the Darien region of Panama. They named their new colony Caledonia and began to build a settlement they named New Edinburgh. Unfortunately for these would-be settlers, they quickly ran into problems. Ships sent to supply them were shipwrecked, and many of the supplies that they had brought with them had spoiled. The area was also rife with tropical diseases, and many died of fever and other ailments. To further complicate things, the area that they had settled was claimed by Spain, and King William of England, not wanting to antagonize the Spanish, had ordered all the English settlements, such as Jamaica, to not help the Scots. After over 400 of them had died, including Paterson's wife, the first settlers decided to abandon the colony and return to Scotland. Unknown to them, a second group of 1,300 colonists had set sail. These arrived to find to their surprise that the colony had been abandoned, and what had been built had been largely destroyed by the Spanish. The new colonists attempted to rebuild, but faced the same problems as the first group, and were later attacked by the Spanish and forced to leave. Altogether, of the over 2,000 people who left for the colony, only a few hundred survived. Many historians believe that the failure of what is now called the Darien Scheme led a few years later to the 1707 Act of Union, which officially united Scotland and England, with the Scottish Parliament voting itself out of existence. The belief is that the Scottish nobility had lost so much of its wealth that they saw their best chance to recover was to join with England, especially when part of the agreement was that England would wipe out the large Scottish national debt and offer other financial incentives. Of interest to me were the ministers involved in the expeditions. Unusually for a colony at the time, the charter granted religious freedom to all, providing that they refrained from blasphemy and kept the Sabbath, though even these restrictions were not actively enforced, as one of the ministers would later complain about all the trading that took place on Sunday. His clever solution was to invite the natives who showed up to trade to church services. The General Assembly of the Church of Scotland had been very supportive of the idea of establishing a colony. They appointed two ministers, Adam Scott and Thomas James, to serve as the first clergy in the new colony, with the idea of not only ministering to the colonists, but also starting a missionary work to the natives. This is said to be the first missionary work done by the Church of Scotland. Unfortunately, Thomas James was one of the many who died of fever on the voyage over. The other minister, Adam Scott, passed away only a few months after landing. Later, during the second expedition, 4 more ministers were sent. Only one of them would return to live in Scotland. One perished on the voyage. Another, Alexander Shields, was a famous Covenanter, even serving as a minister to the Cameroonians, the militant Covenanters. Shield would perish in Jamaica on the return voyage. One of the ministers, Archibald Stobo, had a miraculous escape. While the ship that he and some other survivors were on stopped at Charleston, what was then the colony of Carolina, to resupply, he was invited to preach at a local church. While he and his wife and a few others were away, a hurricane suddenly struck and the ship was wrecked, with the loss of most on board. A short time before this, a minister of an independent Congregational church in Charleston had passed away, and the church asked Stobo to be their new pastor. Seeing it as the will of God that he and his wife survived, they agreed, and he remained the pastor of the church for a number of years, before becoming an itinerant preacher and helping to organize the Presbyterian churches all across the colonies, living and serving in America until his death almost 40 years later. Stobo and his wife had a daughter named Jean, who married a man named James Bullock. They in turn had a son, Archibald Stobo Bullock, named for his grandfather. This son would become the first governor of Georgia and fight in the American Revolution. His great-granddaughter would be Martha Bullock, who would become the mother of Theodore Roosevelt, the president under whom the Panama Canal was built, essentially completing the dream of the Darien colonists. I hope you've enjoyed this wee bit of history. Goodbye for now.